We're live.
Hey.
Hey.
Calling Chris Anderson in London.
This is Chris Anderson in London, calling Rick Beyer in somewhere.
Not Chicago.
Not Chicago.
Not Chicago, as you can tell from the Art Deco. No, the art.
Your whole house is decorated with art like that.
I am in beautiful Arvada, Colorado.
Well, there you go.
Visiting my sons. This is my second show in a row on the road, or not in a row, but second show in recent memory. Now, didn't you also do a show on the road?
I did.
Last summer, right?
From York.
Yeah. Right. So we are experienced road warriors here. Welcome everybody to History Happy Hour, brought to you with the help of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours. This gentleman here, Chris Anderson, and I can be found pretty much every Sunday here because we don't have anything better to do.
Here, there, or anywhere.
On the History Happy Hour Facebook and YouTube pages. And we want to give a big thank you to the growing list of folks who are supporting this effort via Patreon, especially our top shelf sponsors, Stephen Ferber, Stephen Dean, Eric Flint, and Chris Templin. And if you want to help us keep the history taps open, you can join us there on Patreon. And I think I can push a button, Chris, and make that link come up. It's very exciting.
Oh, look at that. You're very quick.
Technology is an amazing thing.
It is an amazing thing.
Who's here, Chris? Who's joining us?
Jack Sadler's here. Brian Hurst. Yvonne Williams. You're here, of course. Ken Hartrip. Thomas Benner. And the list continues.
No, excellent. It's good to thank you, everybody, for being here. And, well, I think we are just about ready to get started.
Oh, you're ready.
All right. Are you ready, or you need a little more time?
I think
I mean, I don't want to rush you.
No, good.
All right. Give us a shot here. Okay, I'm not ready, turns out. So, turns out. But one more time.
The bar is open.
The bar is open, Chris. What's on tap today?
Well, what's on tap today? We have a very exciting new book. Susan Ronald has written a book about Joseph P. Kennedy, the ambassador and the, I guess, the matriarch of the whole Kennedy clan. Patriarch. Sorry, yes, patriarch of the whole Kennedy clan. And she presents kind of a different founding story of the Kennedy family, which we're going to dive into, which is very interesting. Susan Ronald is well suited to write this book, as she is an expat American living in Britain, so she can approach this question from both sides of the fence. She's written extensively on a number of topics, but her books have included Condé Nast, The Man and His Empire, Hitler's Art Thief, Hildebrand Gurlitt, the Nazis and the Looting of Europe's Art Treasures, and Heretic Queen, Elizabeth I and the Wars of Religion. So those are just a few of her books, but with this book, she's turned her attention to Mr. Kennedy. So,
and we turn our attention to Susan Ronald. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you guys?
We are excellent, and I do, in honor of being in Colorado, I do just want to mention I have a Colorado beer here. So I know that that's probably not going to get a lot of. It's not going to impress anybody there in Great Britain, but
No.
Listen, the last time I was in Colorado, I went to the Coors Brewery.
There you go. There you go.
There you go. Okay.
She still lives and breathes.
Yes, exactly. Oh, well, anyway, fantastic. Lovely to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Susan, obviously, we're going to get into the weeds here about Mr. Kennedy. But when we think of the Kennedys and the Kennedy clan, what most readily comes to mind is JFK and Camelot and Jackie O and all of that. And the father, he's kind of mentioned in the background. So what is it about Kennedy that you thought this man needs a biography, and how did you turn to this as a subject?
Okay, that's a very good question to get started with. There are other biographies about Joe. As a matter of fact, I think there are almost 18 biographies about him, quite a few, but not one is solely about him as the ambassador to Great Britain, 1938 to 1940. Crucial period of time. Certainly, Roosevelt had so many problems with Congress internationally. There was the Neutrality Acts. America didn't want to have anything to do with another European war. And Kennedy decided, probably as early as 1935, that he wanted to come to Britain to learn about international politics and maybe, as well as putting his sons on the right road to become president themselves, or actually Joe Jr., not Jack. He might even run for vice president or president himself, he thought. So in my opinion, I like finding what I call neglected stories. Originally, when I pitched it to my editor, I said that I wanted to do a story about the ambassadors, because there were so many men who were helping to change the focus in Britain in particular at that time. You had Harry Hopkins, who was, the special envoy from the president. You had Sumner Wells, who was less effective, but he was very effective in South America. You had all kinds of people that were visiting. You had William Bullitt in Paris, who thought he was running the whole show. You had all kinds of people who were interfering, and I mean really, really interfering. And Britain, for better or worse, was still an empire, and it was still the world's largest empire at this point in time, which made it an incredibly important trading partner from the point of view of the United States. Now, the only reason why Kennedy got the job that he lusted after was really because he had been a movie mogul, and there was a very important trade agreement that was definitely going south. He had to be in Britain by January 38 to be able to successfully negotiate the new film deal. The film deal was going to expire on March 18th, 1938. America knew about it since 1928. It was a 10-year deal. Okay, but for the weirdest reasons, which I don't quite understand still, Kennedy didn't tip up until the 1st of March. And I'm saying, okay, this is a real story, because I also knew the other things that were happening. I mean, the guy who ended up replacing him, Gil Wynant, was absolutely adored. He was a former governor of New Hampshire. He was adored by the British. But even he had problems dealing with Roosevelt and Harriman and all these other people that were interfering.
So Joe Kennedy is he's a businessman. He, as you said, he's a mogul. He's an Irish Catholic from Boston, and even his friends think that this is a kind of a terrible idea, that he's really going to be terrible at this, which he kind of is. And FDR knows all of his limitations, that he's not, doesn't have any diplomatic training. He tends to mouth off. He likes to go rogue. He's really out for himself. And yet he still appoints him. And Susan, I know there was a movie deal, but there was this other thing going on at the same time with this guy in Germany, Adolf Hitler, and the potential of war. What in the Lord's name is Roosevelt thinking as he's doing this? You must have asked yourself this question every page of the book.
Yeah, even before I started writing. I have several theories about why Roosevelt agreed to it. The easiest theory is that Kennedy was less dangerous to Roosevelt outside of America, where he could not get involved with the isolationist Congress, where he couldn't manipulate the American press that he was so good at manipulating. He really was. And so that's the one theory. The second theory is January 38. I mentioned it before. Why wasn't he in England in January 38? Well, the reason why he didn't go, I believe, is twofold. Firstly, Roosevelt had made an offer for everybody to sit around the table in January 38. And guess what? Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain went, this is a bomb coming out of America. Oh no, We can't have the Americans involved again in Europe. I mean, look what they did to Europe after the First World War. I mean, heaven forbid, or the Great War, as I call it, because of course you can't have a First World War if you haven't had a second, right? So at this point in time, Roosevelt is really hacked off with Chamberlain, very angry with him. But his hand had actually been forced into naming Kennedy as the replacement. He wanted Tom Watson from IBM, who would have also been a terrible choice. He'd had the Golden Eagle from Hitler 2 years before. I mean, this guy was. All these people are wonderful. So basically, what happened was Arthur C. Kroc, who was the this is interesting, who is the Washington bureau chief for the New York Times, had leaked that Kennedy was appointed. Okay, he's appointed at the beginning of December, when in fact he hadn't been appointed. And as a matter of fact, the previous ambassador, Bingham, who was deathly ill at Johns Hopkins University Hospital, hears about this, and then he dies. And Roosevelt blamed Kennedy for his death. So, but how
That's
can
a
he go
great
against?
start, right?
Yeah, how can he go against the New York Times, right? And Kroc went to enormous lengths pretending that it had all been, done properly, and he sends a memo at midnight, the night before the release. The whole thing was just a trumped-up job. Now, you ask, why did Kroc do that? Well, in his own memoir, he said he never was paid anything by Kennedy, right? That's if you don't count the $25,000 a year plus expenses.
Unbelievable.
Plus trips, okay?
Unbelievable.
So, okay, fine. You want to be like that? Fine. So Roosevelt decided that, and he complained to Schlesinger, because he was the owner of the New York Times at the time. He said, what's going on here, guys? Oh, I have to back my bureau chief, so forth, and so on and so forth. So what does Roosevelt do at the beginning of January? He sends Kennedy west to California and Seattle to handle the last bits and pieces that he hasn't done in the Maritime Commission, when he should have been sending him across the ocean. So Roosevelt has this desire to absolutely hang Kennedy as early on as before he's actually sworn in as the ambassador. Okay? Now, he feels he can do this because of the reaction of Chamberlain. All right? Chamberlain is.
We are losing you a little bit, Susan.
Well, the Americans involved? Fine. Americans won't be involved. Oh, sorry. You got me?
We are just
Hello?
losing you a little bit.
You're losing a
Hello?
bit.
You
Can you hear
might.
us?
It says I'm here on my
You're here.
thing.
We can see you. You're just a drag on the audio.
Yeah, I hear you.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm here. Okay.
Yeah, I think we're good.
It's very exciting.
Okay.
So go ahead, Chris.
Oh, okay, fine. I'm talking more slowly.
Yeah. Susan, for those people who don't know, how does Kennedy? Yeah,
You want to say something?
yeah. How does Kennedy? Like, where does he come from, and what's his power base? I mean, I understand that he's an Irish Catholic in Boston, but he's not. He's a union buster. He's not working class, and you would think that if there was a cheerleader for Catholics in America, it would be Al Smith or LaGuardia or. I mean, what's Kennedy's power base? How does he actually get to that point?
Well, Kennedy, his father was Ward 2 boss in East Boston. Okay, if you read Edwin O'Connor's The Last Hurrah, or if you see Spencer Tracy in the film, you can understand what a ward boss was all about. And he basically gave largesse to his fellow poor immigrant Irish Catholics. This is Patrick Kennedy, Joe's father. And it gave them booze, it gave them comfort, gave them food, clothing for the children and all that. but he also got wealthy off of their patronage because he got them to vote Democrat. Okay, so that was the beginning. Patrick Kennedy then basically became middle class. He sent Joe through school at Protestant schools, okay, which made the chip on his shoulder about the size of Mount Everest, okay, because he was a Protestant, he wasn't a Brahmin, he wasn't part of the in crowd. So going to Boston Latin and then on to Harvard really made him see how different he was in so many ways. But Joe could charm, and not only women, but he could actually charm people who were of use to him. So Kirstein, who was Jewish, who owned Filene's, okay, ended up backing Joe to buy a non-entity film distribution company, okay. He then becomes friends through Kirstein with the head of Transamerica Corporation, and he had what Joe did have, which was quite amazing, was this financial acumen. He saw the opportunity to make money legally, if not morally, okay, in all sorts of different ways. That doesn't mean that he was an economist or that he understood the economy. And basically, because he was making things happen, he became press worthy. Okay, he was influencer, is our word today, and he absolutely lavished
Susan,
money on the press.
We've gotten
Holiday
90. We've gotten 90. We've gotten 90%.
Listen, going. He then decided it was him in the 20 pain, okay, to Battle Smith. Gives money, gives $50,000.
Buys his way in.
Should I talk early again?
Susan, we are just having I'm so sorry about this, but I'm going to suggest to you, Chris and I will tap dance for a minute. If you can drop out, turn your computer off, turn it on again, and rejoin us.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Sorry.
Isn't this fun, everybody? I said if you can, we're just still having a little bit of trouble, although we've got almost everything you said. If you can turn your computer off and turn it on again and rejoin us, we'll tap dance for a few minutes while you're doing that, and that will probably fix the problem. And she's frozen completely now.
Yeah.
So, Susan, if you can hear me, I'm going to drop you out. Just turn your computer off, restart it, and come back. Thanks, everybody, for hanging in here for a moment with us on History Happy Hour. This is what the excitement is.
Yeah.
This is live television.
Live television is like.
I'm going to just take her out of the stream here and say, hopefully she will come back in and rejoin us. And we'll see. Just to say that our guest, who we just lost there for a moment,
Welcome and lost.
is Susan Ronald, who's author of the new book, The Ambassador, which comes out actually Tuesday, I think, in the United States.
Yeah.
Is it already out in Britain, Chris?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, so it's coming out very shortly. Although I did see one of our guests, one of our audience members said that that they were reading the book right now. So, and we do have some questions for Susan when she comes back, so we can try to bring in the audience to talk with her about that.
So no, but kind of it's an interesting kind of origin story, how the Kennedys, where they start, and how they get going. And
this is the whole Kennedy family at that time, which is I think 9 children, right? You've got Jack standing up there in the left.
Well, and they call the children the 9 hostages, which I think is kind of a funny nickname for the family. And it's you'll in the book, one of the things that will strike you is just how awful the father is in many ways, but he's also a very devoted father. So it's an interesting, I don't know, interesting collection of personalities.
Well, and I think, we were talking about what he did beforehand, and he'd been involved in liquor distribution, he'd been involved in shipping, and been involved in Hollywood. He's a very successful businessman. Hi, Susan.
Hello.
Hello, let's try.
It's so nice to see you
It's
again.
so nice to see you again.
Great to be here. I'm glad
because
that
we
thing
were-
came back on.
We were tap dancing, and our tap shoes are not that great.
Okay, all right, yeah. So you were asking about what his base was. Basically, people wanted to stick close to him to make money.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's money, and it's
influence.
charm,
Yeah.
and all,
He
all
could
of
be
that
very
stuff.
charming. Yeah.
I'm going to bring in a few questions that we have from our viewers. Nancy is asking, I mean, this is kind of jumping ahead, not exactly, but it'll jump us forward. And she asked, was Kennedy really more isolationist, or was he more pro-Hitler? And I would add to that question, is there a C category that is both? And I mean, this is kind of the crux of his ambassadorship, right? Is that he's on the wrong side of history.
Yes, and whenever you're on the wrong side of history, no matter what you do, you're not in a good place. Kennedy was quite simply, and he was some of those things, but not all. He was an isolationist. He believed in a fascist government. Only a fascist government, he told Roosevelt, would succeed. Okay? And Roosevelt said to a number of people, well, as long as Joe Kennedy is in charge of the fascist government, I'm sure he's right. He admired Mussolini. A lot of people did. Mussolini's fascism initially was quite different from Hitler's, but as they became allies, then of course it turned into Hitler Mark II, or a poor relation of Hitler. So Kennedy was an isolationist, as were, I'd say, 75% of Congress. Okay, most congressmen were isolationist. America had its own real problems, and had to handle these. Then he wasn't necessarily pro-Hitler, but he loved the fascist ideal. He was terrified of socialism and communism. And in the 1930s, the popular belief went, if you're against the communists and the socialists, well, you have to be pro-fascist. This was the thing behind, in some ways, behind appeasement. So he was pro-fascist, there's no doubt about it. But because he was such an arrogant SOB, he, am I allowed to say that on air?
Absolutely.
Anyway.
You can spell it out if you need to.
Well, because he was so arrogant, he actually wrote to Roosevelt. He spoke to Halifax, who was the foreign minister in Britain. He also actually said to Chamberlain, let me meet with Hitler. Everything will be sorted.
Oh, he can
I'll
fix
fix it.
He can fix
I'll
everything.
fix it all. Yeah. I mean, at one point, he was part of $1 billion deal, or £1 billion deal, to basically put all of Nazi Germany back on a peace footing. What's that about? Okay. He had no idea about the politics of the day. He had no understanding of the politics. And all that mattered was his worldview. And of course, it's bad enough in a president, okay, who at least has Congress to stop him. But when you're an ambassador and you think that you could run foreign policy from your place in London, that makes things really awkward, okay? And it was Kennedy who pushed Roosevelt into this secret relationship with Churchill in '39, okay? So,
in
what
other
can I
words,
say?
it was because
Couldn't trust him.
couldn't trust him, had to deal directly with Roosevelt, and so
Yeah.
we can thank Joe Kennedy for.
Well, there you go. So
inspiring
there's a
the
silver
special
lining.
relationship. So
There you go.
that's Chris's
my thing.
favorite. So now he's going to love Joe Kennedy.
Yes.
It's called the law of unintended consequences.
Yeah, really.
Okay.
So just so he is sent to the court of St. James at probably one of the most pivotal moments in world history in the 20th century. And right out of the gate, let's just run down a few of the events he's there for. The Anschluss with Austria, the Munich crisis, Kristallnacht.
Yep.
What is his reaction to this?
Well, let's start with day one. Day one,
Okay.
he arrived. Day one, he arrives in London.
It's going to be a long show, folks.
Sorry, I'll whiz through. Day one,
No.
day one, he hates his 52-bedroom house. It's not good. He hates the embassy. He says that he should be Queen of the May if he works in that embassy. He then goes to see Halifax and treats him to some plain spokenness.
Halifax, who is the foreign minister.
Foreign minister, yeah. Says America's not going to get involved in anything with you, and you're mad if you think that they will. Halifax writes to his ambassador in Washington saying, Mr. Kennedy was in fine form. Why? Because Halifax has been here so often in the past. I mean, he was viceroy to India. He understood how other cultures worked, even though he was extremely religious. He was very, very top tier Anglican. He didn't mind that Joe was a Catholic. Joe minded that he was a Catholic. Nobody cared in England whether or not he wore breeches on day 7 to his getting his credentials approved by the king. But the American press went wild over, is he going to wear short trousers or not? It wasn't important, okay? But because the British aristocracy had been told to be nice to Joe, Randolph Churchill, who is a nasty son of a gun, basically said to Joe, there was only you and the waiters in long trousers that day. So, good put down, Day 2, he meets Chamberlain, doesn't put Chamberlain's back up, tells Chamberlain that, the U.S. isn't going to get involved. So guess what happens? Chamberlain's elated. He wants to hug Kennedy because he doesn't want America involved, okay? By day 7, okay, he's writing to Washington to say there's not going to be anything going on. Day 7 is actually the 10th of March, okay, in the job. Guess who he meets? Ribbentrop. Ribbentrop's in London to basically pass the baton to his successors, a guy called von Dirksen, who is the ugliest son of a gun. I think you might have a picture of him because there's one in the book.
I don't have one.
Oh, that's a pity.
So buy the book and you'll see the picture.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly.
He's got a dueling scar here and here. It's just totally. Well, anyway, von Dirksen's another piece of cake. But so he has this 20-minute talk with Ribbentrop on his own. Day 7, the day before the Anschluss. And he tells Ribbentrop, America won't get involved. Okay?
Well, but isn't there, and Susan, and there's another meeting, I know it's a little later, but there's another meeting with von Dirksen, right? Where he basically says, I'm okay with what you're doing to the Jews, but can you not talk about it so much?
Don't be so loud about it.
Don't make such
Don't
a
be
fuss
so loud
about it.
Exactly. That's 3 months later. But guess what? Day 10, okay, he's got to make a speech at the Pilgrim Society. It's an Anglo-American society, Guess what it's about? The Pilgrims. And he calls Hull and says to Hull, I don't like the idea of you making, who's the Secretary of State. Yeah, Cordell Hull is the Secretary of State. I don't like the idea about you making an announcement before I make my speech about what Germany's done in Austria.
Right, because Joe Kennedy wants to be the one making policy.
Yeah. And guess what he does? He tells Cordell Hull, who's the Secretary of State, shut up. Tries to speak to Roosevelt. And you know what they say to him? Really sorry, but Mr. Roosevelt is at the dentist's. What a great lie.
So, Susan, but I mean, this is a question that I have, and one of our guests was kind enough to ask it. Eric wants to know how much of an impact do his antics, I would say, have on American public opinion as the war approaches? I mean, is he just a crazy guy in London, or is he actually having an impact on how America's dealing with the situation?
Well, the short answer is he does have an impact, okay? Because he has a number of American newspapers, not the least the New York Times, that quotes him as being the savior of the world, okay? This could be why the New York Times is going to review my book. Anyway, so he basically has a number of good friends in the American press that don't want to say bad things about him. That's the first point. Second point is he ends up involving Charles Lindbergh, who, for all of the great things that he did and all of the very serious flaws that he had, Lindbergh, of course, became the spokesperson for the America First Committee.
Right, they must have been good buddies.
Yeah, they were good buddies. And not only that, but Joe commissioned a report on the German Air Force from him with his own money, okay, which made its way into Washington circles, that nobody should go to war against Germany. They'll just wipe you clean from the face of the earth, okay? Now, Lindbergh comes back in when war is declared, or shortly before war is declared, to become the spokesman for the pro-fascist movement, to make America great again. I know you guys have heard that slogan before, but the first time it was made was in 1939, okay? So Joe comes back October 1940 and dedicates the next year of his life to going out and speaking and meeting with people in America to try and stop any movement towards war, okay? And he's very vocal about it. He was involved in a number of scandals. And it was actually, when you have a character like Joe, I didn't want to let him go. So I looked into that some more, and it became the inspiration for my next book, okay? So there were a lot of high net worth individuals and aristocrats is what I'm calling them. Hitler's aristocrats. Whether that's going to be the title at the end of the day, I don't know. The manuscript's due in October. But basically, there were a lot of very, very powerful people and institutions in America that were extremely pro-fascist. Yeah. And when I say institutions, Morgan's, Colgate, Heinz, the list is very long. Standard Oil, okay? Standard Oil was a biggie. And the people behind these organizations. So I found it incredibly interesting. And Joe got involved with somebody who had $300,000 that they wanted to contribute in the West Coast for a fascist uprising. Okay, you have a quote that's in the afterword of your book, and it's the sort of thing that we could have raised right in the beginning. We can do it in the middle. We could do it at the end. Yeah. But you write, Kennedy placed prosperity above human life and liberty, above democracies being crushed, above loss of life for those who opposed the Nazis in Europe or whoever was unfortunate enough to be Jewish, and sadly, above right and wrong. I mean, you don't exactly beat around the bush here, Susan, in feeling that this guy was, disaster is the kindest word you can say. Yeah, he was, to quote Roosevelt, he was a very dangerous man. He was able to persuade people, because people wanted to believe that somebody was going to stop this madness, okay? Somebody was going to be able to find a magic bullet to stop Hitler and to stop Mussolini. But of course, nobody could because they were using the wrong ammunition, okay? And Joe's contribution to all of that only made matters worse. He was one of many, though, one of a lot of people who felt that fascism was better than communism. He had all of the reports from the Anschluss, okay? So that's 2 weeks into, well, not even 2 weeks, 11 days into his time as ambassador. And the Anschluss is when the Nazis march into Austria. Correct, and reunite the two countries. And it goes on and on and on about the remorseless killing, the senseless looting of people's properties. Even people who aren't Jewish, political opponents of the Nazis in Austria. One man was brought in. I mentioned him very briefly in the book. He was brought in for questioning, and he knew that they were going to actually torture him mentally by killing his family. So what does he do? He kills them and then kills himself. Okay,
right.
These
In
are
Austria, right?
In Austria, Kennedy had all of the documentation,
And still,
but Jews were Jews. Everybody had their favorite Jew. Sorry, that shouldn't have come through. That's supposed to be off. Forget my computer going ding.
oh, didn't hear it. So, but thanks for telling us.
All right, good. Anyway, so it was very upsetting. In June 38, against our dear friend Chamberlain's wishes, Roosevelt was behind setting up an international intergovernmental committee to look at the plight of the Jews and political opponents, okay? And this was a conference at Avion in June 1938, and it was agreed that this intergovernmental committee would continue, and they would go on and try and find a resolution to the Jewish problem, but also to the political problem. And Kennedy was really angry that he hadn't been appointed the head of it. It was a Washington lawyer called George Rubley who was. And where did Rubley work after June, after the Avion conference? He worked out of the embassy in London. Everything was located in the embassy in London. There's no way that Kennedy could say that he didn't know anything, particularly because he was constantly looking at Rubley's stuff. He'd go in there and ferret around and try and figure out how he could get an edge, which he finally did after Kristallnacht. Okay,
So go ahead, Rick.
No, I was going to you.
Well, I mean, okay, so we talked a little bit about your theories as to why Roosevelt sends him to this position.
Yeah.
Clearly, Roosevelt knows what's going on. Other people know what's going on. So what is Roosevelt doing? You talk a little bit about this in the book, but what's he doing to get around him, to have an end run? Because foreign policy still has to be conducted, and clearly he's not the guy to do it.
No, exactly.
So how do we make this all work?
Okay, so in the WSJ review, there was a very lovely quote at the very end of the review about the fact that an ambassador is a gentleman you send to a foreign country to lie for your own country. Okay, we missed out on the first bit with Joe. He wasn't a gentleman. Okay,
Right.
So Roosevelt kind of liked this idea, and he would send letters to Halifax via Lindsay, who was the British ambassador to Washington. He would send letters to the king in the pouch, sealed, and Joe would have to deliver them. I mean, it's his way of belittling Joe as much as he possibly could. Because, of course, if he opened them, then it was immediate dismissal and disgrace. And the one thing that Roosevelt knew he had on Joe was Joe would not do anything to jeopardize the learning process for Joe Jr. Okay, so Joe Jr. was swanning around Europe, being Joe Kennedy's eyes and ears in Europe, his trusted eyes and ears. Never mind the lack of experience. That's not important. So Roosevelt was developing direct relationships. He found Chamberlain really difficult, and Chamberlain was difficult for him to be dealing with. He was rather pedantic, quite Victorian in his ways. He did not understand America or the United States remotely, and had no inclination to understand America. Whereas Halifax was much more relaxed with America effectively taking over from the British Empire, because even though Churchill was an imperialist, we can discuss that till the cows come home, but he wanted the British Empire to continue. Halifax understood that the sun had set, because after the First World War, Britain couldn't even afford to repay the American debt. As a matter of fact, I write in the book, that only got repaid during David Cameron's time as prime minister.
Right.
It's crazy.
Right.
So yeah, Roosevelt also then started sending envoys. He did send Sumner Wells. He also had people like Bullitt and Phillips, who was in Rome,
Other
look into
ambassadors.
other ambassadors, get involved. But Joe, the thing that was so incredible, and Joe was always AWOL when it mattered.
Yeah.
Okay. Where is he in September 1938? Having an affair with Marlene Dietrich on the Côte d'Azur. Okay. Oh, I'm going to go to William Bullitt in Paris, and I'm going to sit in on a meeting that I'm not invited to. Okay. He comes back. Where is he? At Kristallnacht. Okay. He is in London. Oh goodness, he's in London. But he goes off 3 weeks later for a 2-month holiday. Okay. He comes back in February 39. Actually, it's 2.5 months, and he has a letter, that is inviting him to Rome for the coronation of Pius XII, who is his great mate from 1936. He introduced Roosevelt to him and all this sort of thing. Where's he go? He goes off to Rome. He's in Rome when the Nazis take over the rest of Czechoslovakia. So he's never in the right place at the right time.
No,
and that also helps him. The great thing about his tenure is Herschel V. Johnson, who is his chargé d'affaires, was a fantastic number 2. He actually should have been ambassador.
That's a book to write, huh?
Yeah.
That's a book to write.
Well, he became ambassador afterwards to Brazil.
I want to bring in a few, just a couple of quick comments from people, which I just want to point out. Rich Randall says, great show. I didn't think I could dislike Joe Kennedy anymore, but I was wrong.
Okay.
And Carolyn says, and I think this is an interesting thought, maybe this is why Joe was marginalized in the 1960 election. Well, clearly,
One of the reasons. The other reason was his... Jack knew how anti-Semitic he was.
Yeah, so he is going to be bad news to be out in front. Well, take your money, Joe, but keep quiet.
Yeah.
And there was a question also that someone asked. I'm just looking for it. Maybe you can find it. Oh, here it is. Frank asks about his relationship with King George, and you write about after the war has begun. You write about a tea. They have tea together. And I think of all the things in your book, maybe what blew me away the most was this interchange in which Kennedy essentially says, well, why don't you let Hitler take over Europe? You guys don't need it anyway, and you're going to get thrashed. And King George is the one who has to say, well, Mr. Kennedy, we're two great democracies fighting against everything that democracies detest. This is kind of what we have to do. And it's like he's got to school Joe Kennedy in the very basics.
And this is at the end of his tenure as
after
ambassador.
He's already all that great experience.
Exactly. But every time George VI had to meet him, aside from perhaps the first time, even the first time, I could feel him cringing. I mean, the most beautiful part about writing the book is obviously going to original sources. That's my big thing. And it's quite a big deal to get into the Royal Archive, okay? And even then you have to send them the pages that have George VI, in this case, his name on it, so they can approve it, okay? Nothing was changed. Everything was fine. But they gave me his diaries to look at for the period. And time and again, it's, Mr. Kennedy must be a very unhappy man. Wonderful British understatement. But he was, I think, quite shaken by that tea. If for George VI to pick up his pen when he knows that the ambassador is leaving and to write the letter that he wrote to Joe shows quite clearly that he wasn't going to let this sit. He wasn't going to allow this upstart, whoever he was. And, don't forget, he was the 9 children envoy. That was his greatest claim to fame when he arrived in Britain, okay? So he wasn't going to allow Kennedy to tell him, King of England and King of the British Empire, anything about democracy. Joe did not understand politics. George VI, frankly, comes across as quite a hero. Yeah. He really does. So there wasn't a relationship.
All right, I mean, he's almost delusional, Kennedy.
Yeah.
At any point, the war has started. Eventually, he loses a son to the war. Does the light bulb ever go off?
No,
Did you find that he says, "Oh boy"?
What he tried to do is to get the boys to get a cushy job, okay? And they knew, or certainly Joe Jr. knew, that wasn't going to make him president, okay? This is a war. America will come in at some point in time, Joe Jr. thought. Although he was very much his father's son. Anything Joe said, he spat out again, okay? He always used to start his political arguments with, "My father says," and then give his political argument. Whereas Jack, who'd been a sickly child from the age of 3, who had all kinds of problems that they could never find out about. I mean, he ended up, he had Addison's disease, but they only discovered that in 1947. So he went through his entire childhood and young adulthood a very sick boy, and nobody could figure it out. Jack read. Jack loved history. He was the reader in the family. He never contradicted his father directly, but he understood politics. He understood the Palestinian problem, that the British Empire had actually made a previous agreement with the Arabs to the famous Balfour Declaration. So therefore, there are two contradictory agreements here. Jack understood it. He wrote to his father about it. Joe ignored it. All that mattered was Joe Jr. From birth, Joe Jr. was going to be president. So when Joe Jr. died in 1944, by the way, as the first drone pilot, okay, which I know is a slight contradiction in terms, but they had to take off in the plane with the pilot and a co-pilot. The plane exploded, and it took off from England. Yeah. It exploded within a minute of takeoff, and both Joe Jr. and his co-pilot were killed. Bodies were never found. Okay, Jack is in the hospital. He's already had his PT 109 experience. He's got a very bad back by now, in addition to the Addisons, which nobody knows about. And he hears about his brother's death, and his reaction is, "Oh God, now I guess I have to be president." You know, did the light ever go on? We will never know. Joe's reaction was really bizarre. A priest came to tell them what had happened. Comes to the house on the Cape. They tell the whole family together, except for, well, Jack isn't there, of course, he's in the hospital. Joe goes upstairs, stays there for hours. It is never discussed in the family, ever, at all, period.
Wow.
Okay? So to me, that means the light bulb did not go on. By the time Joe dies in 1968, he's got his 3 eldest sons have been killed. His daughter Kathleen has died in a plane crash. His daughter Rosemary is a victim of a botched lobotomy. So that's his 5 eldest children are gone. Okay? And guess what? He stays alive long enough to see Teddy and Chappaquiddick. You know, I mean, I asked the question in the book, if he had known what all of his ambition and striving was going to do, would it have changed the way he thought about things? I don't know. I don't think it would have.
No.
I don't think it would have.
Susan, one thing we haven't talked about yet is we've talked about a little bit about Chamberlain and Lord Halifax, who was the secretary, essentially the British foreign minister, the British equivalent of the Secretary of State. And there's another figure we've just barely touched on who was involved in British politics at this time, who comes to some prominence later on, which is
who's that?
This portly gentleman on the right in this photo. And
Piggy.
And I'm guessing that wasn't a very smooth or positive relationship. And what insights can you give to us about that?
Okay. Well, Churchill and his son Randolph invited Kennedy out to lunch within the first 3 weeks that he was ambassador, and Randolph could be pretty abrasive. So he and Kennedy were sparring, and Kennedy said, "If you guys think you're going to go to war and win, you're out of your minds." And apparently, Churchill turned purple, stood up, and gave him a sermon about what he didn't know about Britain and about life. And after that, Kennedy kept trying to say to everybody in America, "You can't trust Churchill. You can't trust Churchill. He's trying to get us into war." Well, yeah, he was. But, duh. So they hated each other. And when I was at the Churchill Library, the thing that really got me was thousands of congratulations when Churchill became the first Lord of the Admiralty after 10 years not in the government, in 1939. Everybody's congratulated him except Joe Kennedy. Okay, when he becomes prime minister in May 1940, everybody's congratulated him in writing except Joe Kennedy.
Wow!
I can't find anything from Joe Kennedy anywhere. But what I did find was a letter from Cordell Hull saying, "The president is demanding that you congratulate Mr. Churchill on becoming prime minister." So what does Kennedy do? He phones him. That's it.
Wow.
Okay.
Wow.
Susan, you when you write a biography, you get into the life of the person you're writing about probably more. You probably know more about Joe Kennedy than other than the Kennedys you're at.
Well, yeah, just those 2 years.
Yeah, well, yeah, right. But even in
enough.
those 2 years, just for those 2 years,
Yeah.
did you ever, like, when you were working on the book, did you ever wake up and go, "I just can't deal with this guy anymore"? I mean, how do you kind of stay with the story? When it's
Because I felt, like I said at the beginning, I love writing about lost stories in history. Okay, so who writes 2 books on Queen Elizabeth I on new territory? I did. Okay, who writes about having discovered personally the greatest art hoard, the Nazi art hoard ever found? I did. That's because I actually saw it in a Swiss bank vault. But nobody wanted to know the story 14 years before it actually broke. I love writing about things that people don't know. And so it's very difficult to do that with very well-known characters. Mm-hmm. So I had to read all of the biographies on Joe. The one that comes closest is by Will Swift, and it's about all the Kennedys during his ambassadorship. Mm-hmm. But it's not about the political and economic side and what Joe was actually doing to hurt America, in my opinion. Yeah. And certainly to hurt his bosses, who were the president and the Secretary of State and the Assistant Secretary of State. The things that he did were just unreal. But they had found ways of getting around him. It's almost like having a slip disc, and your nerves are trying to find ways to get around that slip disc so that you can feel okay again. And it was that kind of thing in my head.
Except that they're trying to get around a problem that Roosevelt created, knowingly.
Well, he knowingly created it because he would have been much more dangerous in Washington. Okay? So this is the thing, he wasn't there for the day-to-day in Washington, which at the time was quite difficult for Roosevelt, domestically as well as internationally. So a lot of wealthy people, I think the best way of saying it, hated Roosevelt for the New Deal, okay, and still do.
Yes.
Okay. All right. But if you think about it, 70% of America didn't have electricity when he took office in 1932. What's that all about? So, Kennedy. You asked me a specific question which I didn't quite answer. Getting up in the morning and telling the story as it really is, as an independent researcher, not being paid by the Kennedy family to write a biography, not being paid by anybody who has a special interest, or being part of an institution which has to be kind of careful what they say, because they may be getting Kennedy money for something. It gives me a great deal of freedom. And I like that. And I think people need to know, this is my biggest problem with a lot of things that are going on today. People need to know the truth about history. And if you don't know the truth about history, it does no good, because we can only learn by our mistakes. So tearing down statues is all well and good. They're terrible people, but they were people of their times. And it would be far better maybe take them out of the parks and put them into a museum with a proper plaque saying, this person was idolized during their lifetime. They did this, 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 and this, but they also did these terrible things. Okay? I just think that we're going down the wrong road. We're weaponizing people's view of history rather than the real thing. And so that's what gets me to work every morning.
Well, and it would have been a slightly different book if it had been paid for by the Kennedy family. I think we can say that. I want to ask you a very quick question. Give me a one-sentence answer, and then we're going to give it over to Chris for our last question. But this is from an audience member who says, was there anything you liked about him?
Yes.
You can have
that was good.
12 more words.
He adored his children. He got a lot wrong. He adored his children. He bent over backwards for them. I mean, the story I love the most, real quick, is Jack's dying of scarlet fever, age 3. Okay, he prays, and gets his local priest in and promises half of his fortune to the Catholic Church. Jack recovers. Oh, fantastic, he recovers. So what does Joe do? He goes out and buys an expensive home in Brookline. He buys a Rolls Royce. He gets all sorts of everything, puts it all in Rose's name. Then he gives half of what he has to the Catholic Church.
That sums it up pretty well.
And that's Jack. That's Joe, rather. But, he adored his children. He really did. The thing with Rosemary was a tragedy waiting to happen. What do you do with a child who has learning difficulties in a family of super high achievers? It was a terrible, terrible tragedy. He was trying to make her better, and he made her much worse. And I think, though, that helped the girls later on in life to get involved in things like the Special Olympics and all of that. So, again, unintended consequences. But yes, he adored his children.
His family. So I'm going to get Chris handing it over to you for
the last big one. Oh, no, Susan. Okay, we've just spent the better part of an hour talking about probably one of the most odious people in U.S. history. He doesn't end his ambassadorship on a high note. He's not thought of very highly. At the end, the world he tried to create comes crashing down around his ears. But somehow his sons, or they go on, and now the Kennedys are American royalty.
Yep.
Well, I know it's a humongous question, so we can make it short. How do the Kennedys get over their father to become the Kennedy family that we know and love? And
kind of normal.
Kind of normal.
Yeah. I think part of very simply put, when you have a bully for a father, okay, and I could say that because I had one. There are two ways you can go. You can either give in to that and become just like them, which was the way Joe Jr. handled it, or you can look at the world around you, you can educate yourself, you can talk to other people, you can become interested in life. This is Joe Jr., Kik, Kathleen, and Jack walking into the House of Commons on the day that war is declared in London. Okay, but basically, you can then look at the world in a different way, and you can say, "Oh, this hatred and everything else is no good." And Jack actually idolized, believe it or not, Winston Churchill. He thought that Churchill was the best thing around. Could he say that to his father? No. He never contradicted his father, but he became his own person. I think that you can either go towards the abuser in the way that Joe Jr. did, or you can learn how to handle people who have different ideas from yourself in a way that's healthy, that doesn't make you sick, that doesn't make you hateful or hurtful. I think, the boys were their father's sons when it came to womanizing. There's no doubt about that. I don't condone it at all, but that's what they were. But when it came to being good individuals, aside from that, they tried. None of them were anti-Semitic. On the contrary. Jack, had he lived, might have done some other great things. But as it was, he was a tremendous inspiration. I mentioned that Kennedy was sending Joe Jr. out to be his eyes and ears in Europe. When there was the very first civilian casualties of the war, Americans and Canadians, who handled it? 23-year-old Jack. Joe was scared to death of bombs, by the way. I didn't say that, but he was called Jittery Joe for a reason. Okay. All right. But I think that what has happened, though, is the fortune that he made has allowed the subsequent Kennedy generations enough leeway not to worry about things, to become dedicated politicians in their own way. But every family has skeletons, every family has problems. So,
True enough. Susan Ronald, thank you so much.
Thank you so much
for joining us today. And Susan
you.
is the author of The Ambassador, Joseph P. Kennedy at the Court of St. James, 1938 to 1940. It's a fraught time. It's a fascinating book with all sorts of details that you won't see anywhere else. And so we so appreciate you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me. And I hope everybody enjoyed it.
Okay. I
Okay.
know they did. And best
Thanks
of
so
luck.
much.
Okay. Take care now. Bye.
Bye-bye.
And Chris, we want to thank everybody who has joined us today. And also, I want to just mention that for anybody, we want to thank all the people who have supported us via Patreon. And I also want to say, if you want to just sign up for our newsletter to get all our inside dope on our newsletter, I just put that link up.
That's secret
for people.
stuff.
I'm putting that link up. I maybe put it up twice by accident. Who knows? And Chris, what do we have on next week? We're still doing shows, right? We're not just stopping at number
Whatever the
69
number is.
here, right? Are we?
Yes.
We're moving on. So what is number 70 going to be about?
Well, as you know, I have just a tiny little interest in the history of Canada's involvement in the Second World War.
Canadians.
And we're going to be discussing the raid at Dieppe. We have the anniversary coming up one day in August. So the customary version that we know about Dieppe is that it was a great disaster, but David O'Keefe, who's been with us before, has found some fascinating information about maybe another little take on the raid and why it happened and how it unfolded the way it did. So we'll be talking about the Dieppe raid with David O'Keefe next week.
Well, and we're going to have to create a whole new playlist on our YouTube page that's just Canadians in World War II. Honestly,
And would that be a bad thing,
honestly,
Rick?
maybe the whole show should just go into
well,
that full-time direction.
You're thinking great minds think alike. Right?
Thanks, everybody, for being with us. Thanks
you.
for staying through our slight technical difficulty, but it was a great interview worth staying for, so thank you so much.
Be safe, everyone.